Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Scott Levi, and I serve as chair of the Department of History, and it is my sincere pleasure to welcome you all to our program today, The Long Shadows of War, a conversation on war, violence, genocide, and memory. Today we have three distinguished participants in our conversation. We have Professor Annette Becker. She's Professor Emerita at the University of Paris and co-director of the Historial de la Grande, the foremost World War I museum and research center in France. Professor Becker has written extensively on the two world wars and genocidal violence, humanitarian politics, intellectuals and artists, and life under wartime occupation. She's authored an impressive number of books, and most recently her book, Messengers of Disaster, Raphael Lemkin, Jan Karski, and 20th Century Genocides, was published in translation at the University of Wisconsin Press in just this year, 2022. Bruce Scates is professor at the Australian National University, a fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia, and a Fulbright visiting scholar in the US who is currently spending some time with us right here on campus. He has written extensively on war commemoration, environmental history, the history of mourning and bereavement, and gender history. His publications include Anzac Journeys, Returning to the Battlefields in World War II, which came out with Cambridge University Press in 2013, The Last Battle, Soldier Settlements in Australia, 1916 to 39, with Melanie Oppenheimer, which also came out with Cambridge in 2016, and World War I, A History in 100 Stories, which came out with Penguin in 2015. Bruno Cabanes is our own Donald G. and Mary A. Dunn Chair in Modern Military History here at The Ohio State University. A member of the steering committee of the Historial de la Grande, he has written on transitions from war to peace, humanitarianism, refugees, and the material culture of war. His publications include The Great War and the Origins of Humanitarianism, 1918 to 24, which came out with Cambridge in 2014, too many numbers. August 1914, there's another number for you, which came out with Yale University Press as a centennial celebration in 2014. Une Histoire de la Guerre, which came out with Seoul in 2018, and Fragments de Violence, which also came out with Seoul in 2020. Professors Becker and Scates are part of a project on globalizing the history of the world wars. This project is being led by Professor Bruno Cabanes, assisted by grad student Cam Gibbons, and it features 13 international World War I and World War II scholars from 6 countries. Following a semester-long online workshop in the fall of 2021, we'll be holding an international conference here at Thompson Library on October 7th and 8th this fall, 2022. I now pass the mic over to my colleagues and recognize Professor Bruno Cabanes. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you very much, Scott, for this generous introduction. Welcome everyone to this workshop and discussion with my two long-time colleagues and friends, Annette Becker and Bruce Scates, and welcome to all of you and also to those who are going to watch us online. I would like to start with actually the general title of this discussion today. I don't know if it seems like the sound is not very good. Is it there? Sure. If that's a bit, I don't know. Is it better? Yes, seems to be better. I'd like to start with the general title of this discussion today, the Long Shadows of War. And we speak today, I think, on what is the 54th day of the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I wanted to know, as historians of war, both of you, how do you situate the news coming out of Ukraine within the longer history of warfare across the 20th and 21st century, and maybe also what do you see as the main challenge for historians like you to become contemporaries of the war violence that you usually study in your research?
Thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm thrilled to be in this great university to speak about this awful topic. And I think your question is very important. I don't think the war has ever left us. When you think of the last years, there have been war around the world, very awful wars, probably the most awful in Syria to compare with Ukraine. But suddenly what happens is that the war is taking place in Europe, and it's taking place when a big power decides, not out of the blue, but decides to invade its neighbor. And it is very different from the wars we have seen recently, which were mainly civil wars. Here you have a real war which is not civil at all. But if I understand well, because it's not my field, I don't speak Russian and I don't speak Ukrainian, and I think it's very important that people like us who know about wars in general are modest about what they can understand when they don't understand the language. I think it's very important to say that to begin. But in what I understand of this war, it was prepared by a will of aggression. And when the aggression is there, we can understand what is aggression. This is something we can do even without the language. But this aggression is grounded on a very long history. And it is where the words we use, aggression, occupation, war crimes, and even genocide, are very important to know where they come from and how they can adapt or not to the situation we are seeing. And I hope that as specialists of wars, the three of us and a lot in the room and others, we can try to use our intelligence of the past situation to try to understand what is going on. And we know very well that there is a lot of propaganda. We know very, very well that the propaganda is on both sides, on every war. It's not only on the side of the aggressor, obviously. And we have to understand what is behind this propaganda and why we should use war crimes. It is for sure. There is a war crime when you don't follow the rule of wars, which are very serious. And for war crimes, there is no way not to deny them. And when they are denied, it's propaganda. And we have some strengths now in our world. It is photography, films, social medias, which are all over the place. And when you see people with their hands tied in the back, it cannot be a cinematic set. It's impossible. It's not a cinema. It is reality. And that's why it is so cruel to look every day. Because what we generally see in our archives, it is there on our screens at every minute. And that's why I think this war has been so terrible for all of us.
Thank you, Annette. What does it mean for an Australian scholar to witness what we see in Ukraine? Maybe it's quite different, of course, from someone who lives in France.
Yes, the particularities of nation do stand out, don't they? I'm very conscious that I have an American audience with me today, and you'll all be familiar with the work of Michael Nabar from the US Army College. And during 2017, Michael refused to speculate about the parallels between 1914 and what was happening with Trump firing those missiles into Syria. What's interesting is that this April, Michael's actually released an article that's exploring the kind of parallels between 2014 and what we're seeing today. And he's very cautious. He's a very cautious historian. We all must be. And I take your point, Annette, about the need to be modest. We don't actually have, we can't begin to reenact 1914 through the scenario of today. But he does make a point which I think is really compelling, and that is the way that things spiralled out of control so very, very quickly, 1914. The moral outrage of the world, I mean, it is almost as if we hear the echo of support for Belgium in what's come out. There is a Ukrainian flag flying right on in every city in Australia at this very moment, as here in the United States. There's a moral outrage of what's going on. Now, he shies away, of course, from the direct parallels, but in a way, the troubled world we face today is kind of a result of that catastrophe back in 1914. The other thing I'd say, as a scholar of commemoration, is wondering how this war will come to be marked in the landscape. And, you know, as early as March, we had I won't say the targeting, but there was sort of missiles were fired into Babignon, you know, a site of memory, a site of mourning. And the question is, how will we mark that site into the future when the debris finally settles down? And there's a great Australian historian, Maria Tamerkin, who argues sometimes that trauma-scapes should be left, that you should leave the wound in the landscape because it will remind you of the horrific power of war. And indeed, again, an echo of the Great War here, that proposal from a character as mad as Churchill, that Ypres be left as a memorial so that we would understand what a devastated city looked like after it had been deluged by artillery. So those questions of how we're going to come to mark the memory of this conflict and also what echoes there are to this conflict back in 1914 is one that intrigues me.
Thank you, Bruce. There is actually an excellent article in the New Yorker this week by Masha Geshen on this question of the memorial in OER. Do you have any reaction to the article?
Yeah.
How more or less a site of memory becomes again a site of mourning?
And it has to do with genocide, and the article shows it very well. Because this word has been used a lot, and it happened to be my specialty since I wrote a book on the way Raphael Lemkin invented the word genocide.
So is it too early to call that genocide?
It's definitely too early, but which is interesting now, it's not so much to see if there is a genocide going on. It's difficult. The first, I would be very brief, but it has to be a very concerted plan in advance. And for sure, the aggression war was planned very much in advance. It began in a way in 2014. But the idea of a genocide, of the entity, you have to have a target people. The Armenians, the Jews, the Tutsi. The target people will be the entire Ukrainian people. It's a little difficult, I think. But the memory of genocides is extremely present in this war. And that's why it's very complicated. Because Babi Yar, the site, which was not targeted by the Russians, but the tower of television, which was near the site, was targeted. This site, which was the biggest, is still the biggest site of the Holocaust by bullet. So the biggest site of genocide of the Jews in the entire time of the genocide during the Second World War is the symbol of genocide for us and for Ukrainians. But it was not so during the Soviet period, because during the Soviet period, it was the great patriotic war of every Soviet who cared about the Jews. Certainly nobody. And so the genocide was sort of denied. And when Mr. Putin puts that there is the great patriotic war, which is betrayed by the Ukrainian, he's the one who is betraying it. So it's very complicated because it's part of the propaganda. And we look at that, and at the same time, we cannot say it's a genocide or not a genocide. And there is another one. There was the famine organized by Stalin in the 30s in Ukraine, which for a number of scholars, Lemkin being the first of them, was a genocide. And it's called in Ukrainian Holodomor. And this Holodomor, now, Putin doesn't speak about it, obviously. He is the heir of Stalin. So why he would speak about a crime of Stalin? He doesn't speak about the Gulag either. He's not going to speak about the crimes of Stalin. But why, on the other side? Why the Ukrainian at the moment? Why President Zelensky, who is the king of communication and is right to be? Why he doesn't use the word genocide for the time of the Holodomor? It is something I don't understand. If you have ideas about it, I would love to listen to them. So you see, the word genocide in itself opens a lot of questions which are fascinating, but I don't think we are going to resolve them very, very quickly.
You just mentioned the book that was just published in translation by the University of Wisconsin Press, Messengers of Disaster, about Lemkin. But your most recent book, I think, was on the notion of l'immontrable, which is kind of difficult actually to translate into English. It's something that you cannot show. Are there things, first of all, how do you conceptualize this notion of immontrable? And do you see things that here in this conflict that cannot be shown, that are immontrable?
It's the idea of you cannot show, but in the same time you can represent. But representation is a transformation of what you see. And that's why on the cover there is another genocide, which is the genocide of the Armenians. And as you see that, you don't understand it is the genocide of the Armenians, so it is not showable. But when you understand what the painter wanted to see, you understand that he's showing the death of his mother during the genocide of the Armenians. So it's exactly the idea. This concept and this reality of killing, of raping, of looting are there all over the wars, and it is there all over Ukraine now. And at the same time, you have a lot of images, you have a lot of people speaking up, but can you really show it totally? That's the question. And so the book is turning around this idea. Actually, yesterday, New York Times, there was an article by a photographer who went to Vietnam and said, I showed so many things from Vietnam, and now I'm looking at the photos of Ukraine. Do we really convey the war? I'm not sure. And I thought this article was very interesting.
The last sentence is very striking. You know, I'm getting tired of those endless disclaimers, like the one at the top of his essay that says, warning, graphic material, the best photograph of war might make us want to look away. It's imperative that we don't. So it's exactly that.
Yeah.
Shall we move away a little bit from Ukraine, and we'll come back to Ukraine at the end of his talk. But I'd like to ask you about your personal, professional trajectories and how the field has changed over time. You both started as not as military historian, but you were initially you started as a labor historian, as a specialist of the of radicalism in the labor movement in southeastern Australia in the late 19th century. And Annette, you started as a specialist of religion, U.S. religion in the early modern period, the Great Awakening, and so first of all, before we try to see how you moved away from, I don't know if it's away actually, from labor history and history of religion to military history. I'd like to ask you questions about the concept that both of you still use as specialists of history of war, that are in a way part of your culture, of historians of religion, and historians of labor. I was thinking for you maybe of a notion of moral economy, which is still central, right? Or maybe there are other concepts that you still use and that are part of your, again, training as a labor historian. And you, maybe, Annette, I was, one of the major books published by you and Stefano Rousseau recently on World War I, 1914-1918, Understanding of the Great War, makes the point that the Great War is a crusade. So that's also interesting. I'd like to know more about that. Shall we start with you, Bruce?
When Bruno said I started in the 19th century, he wasn't referring
no.
to me. However, it was the last century, and it feels like a millennia ago. I guess some of those concepts I was schooled in as by people like George Roudet of moral economy have remained with me throughout my career, particularly when I was looking at the sense of entitlement that soldiers had when they came back from that war. So what you've got to understand in Australia is that we've had a great deal of Great War scholarship. It's only really been in the last 20 years that we've attended to the story of repatriation and rebuilding lives when you return home. And what each of these men and women have is a very strong sense of, we were promised a land fit for heroes. What they got in Australia was marginal land to settle on, land that should never have been farmed. They were sent to farm this land, often crippled by emotional, physical, psychological injuries. And they faced, of course, that massive sense of failure that they could not provide for their families decently, which is what they felt they were entitled to. Now, many of these individuals had, in fact, been trade unionists before they went to war. When they put on that uniform, they didn't cease to have, in many ways, a civilian outlook. They had a sense of justice, a sense of entitlement. And moral economy, I mean, these men and women write tirelessly to the department, advocating their case. We did our best for our country. What is our country now going to do for us? And I think this is a really important conversation to alert us to, because veterans come home from war and they face the challenges of reintegration into civilian life. We're very fortunate in Australia in that we have this extraordinary archive, so we can move from the service record, the wartime story, the soldier settlement file, and the repatriation file. Just to give you an idea of the scale of these sources, 12 kilometres of shelving space. So you take this library and you double it a few times and you'll get how many records we've got. It's an extraordinary testimony, and it's really quite a privilege to work through it and retrieve these voices from people who never accepted that state of powerlessness, who always fought for what they saw as their rights. That is essentially moral economy. It's a political economy as well, but it's a sense of what's fair, what's right, what's just.
Thank you, Bruce. What about you, Annette?
You said we became military historians.
Historians of war.
I'm not sure about I am. I would say that I was always interested by civilians. So they are not in the military, except during the First World War. The First World War and most of Second World War too. The soldiers were civilians in uniforms. So they were halfway between the home front they wanted to defend and the military fronts where they had to fight, or they wanted to fight. And it is where religion comes in. If you don't believe in what you do, you cannot fight, either on the home front or in the military front. And the belief can be highly religious in the normal sense of the word, but it can be also the belief in your fatherland, the belief on your family, the belief in your profession, the belief on something you want to defend. And when you have this belief, you consent to war. And it is in a way what happens in Ukraine now. I don't think that any of the Ukrainians who are fighting so hard now thought they will be able to be at war. But since they are there and they want so much to keep their homeland, they are consenting to this war, which is important on them. But what happens all the time, and there it is at a huge scale, and Bruno is a specialist on that, it's that some civilians are too weak to fight. the women, the children, the elderly, what can they do? Only try to hide or flee. And that's why the number of refugees in our wars, our modern wars, is always absolutely huge. And it's where no war can be just between two countries or three countries. Because of refugees, war comes all over the world because they have to find a place to be. And it is where moral economy comes into it. Isn't it our moral duty to take care of the refugees? And it is what happens just now. And this is a great lesson of the past, that when you don't take care of the refugees, and I'm thinking, by example, of the Jews of the 30s, when you don't take care of them, it finishes very badly.
Bruce? No?
I just would, there's something that you raised there, you both alluded to, are we military historians or not? And this sort of bifurcation between social stroke military history and military history per se is something that I think is beginning to break down, but certainly to give you an instance from my own country, you would have the social historians who'd be working in the University of Melbourne, the University of Sydney, then you'd have, and the cultural historians, and then you'd have the military historians who are of course an ADFA, the Australian Defence Force Academy, and you didn't get much of a conversation between the two of them. And that is crazy because we can't understand what war is unless we have the insight. We need that understanding of what battles are, how armies organise and so on. And by the same token, military history, and I guess a great practitioner of this would be Peter Stanley, who works at the Australian Defence Force Academy, but who's alerted us to the life stories of Indian soldiers and the Raj. It's an extraordinary narrative. So when these two kind of disparate fields connect, there can be a wonderful conversation.
That's what we're
and indeed, this is what you're doing today.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
What do you see? So what do you see as the main evolution? It's difficult, of course, the last, 20, 30 years. Is it the inclusion of civilians into the history of war? Is it the cultural term? Is it the transnational term? The fact that it becomes really, that World War I becomes really global history? What do you see as one of the main transformations and maybe one of the main challenges that you've experienced recently?
Well, I would say that the most dramatic, I'm thinking of the scholars I would have met in the 1980s who were, of course, writing, they were men, and they were writing the story of men at war. What we have seen and what has transformed the landscape of our understanding is feminist scholarship. And by this, I don't just mean that you add women to the mix, although I will add that some of the scholarship on the experiences of nurses or women in the home front has really been outstanding. But rather, of course, how you look at gender relations generally, how war defines men and it defines women, and that sort of tussle between masculinity and femininity. So I think that's been one of the things that's opened up vast new areas of scholarship. It's been well attuned, of course, to cultural history. It's not just looking at the home, but looking at how war is represented in my own field, in commemoration. I guess, well, we all owe such a debt to Ken Inglis, don't we? But Ken's focus was on mostly on the memorial itself, and now the work, partly I think inspired by you, Annette, which is that focus on grief at an intimate, personal level. That's something that's emerged much more strongly in the scholarship. And so too, we're not just looking at the memorial anymore, but the ceremonies that break out around them. I'm not just thinking of the big state memorial. We're thinking, and I wish I could find your memorial. We're thinking too of the memorials that people create in their homes. Those fragile things that embody memory. So this is the way I think that the scholarship has drifted in quite exciting ways.
I just want to add that it goes with much more history of intimacy, of really going to the actual life of individuals at wars or in wars. And this history of intimacy goes a lot with anthropology. And so that's why it's so different from more history, which was more remote of individual and getting more masses, which is very important too. But now we can, and we like archives who speak about the life and grief of individuals, real individual. And by example, Bruce did a series of 100 people at war, which is amazing, because with these 100 Australian portraits, you have everything you want, but it goes with just little detail of every life. And it is personally the kind of history I like, because you are really near the people. Who cares about the great ideas if you don't have people? We are people, and we want to know the people of the past and the people of the present.
Yeah, you've both built your scholarships around individual lives, individual trajectories. You, Annette, was thinking of your work on civilians under occupation, and you, Bruce, absolutely on Anzac soldiers, families visiting the battlefields of Gallipoli, and I want to, and of course you mentioned the story in 100 Stories, which is really an amazing piece. I wanted to know more about the repatriation files, and you just mentioned the women, right? And how the women, how you can hear the women's voice. I was thinking of domestic violence, which is something that we completely tend to forget when we think about war or the aftermath of war, and which is actually part of this repatriation files. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah,
it's really fascinating.
Yeah. The repatriation files, and I should point out that some of the files are now digitised, so they're available to you, and that's really important because this is a global conversation, as we've said. But as you go through those files, approach them with caution. It is rather like that warning you're getting on the television screen. Yeah. It's shocking, it's horrific, and the most horrific files are the files that women write describing the traumatised men who are turning on themselves. They're addicted to alcohol, there's a lot of self-harm, but they're also turning on their wives and their children. These are people who are disintegrating in the face of war. I'll just give you one really graphic instance of this. It concerns the case of a man by the name of Frank Wilkinson. Now, Wilkinson is a war hero. He earns the military medal at Ypres. He comes home, he becomes a soldier settler, he fails on the land, a lot of them did, falls into debt, a lot of them did. He takes his own life, a lot of them did. But the difference with Frank Wilkinson is that before he slits his own throat, he batters both his wife and his 4-year-old daughter to death. Now, what I found very, very interesting in that file was the sympathy that that community actually extended. They could see a man who'd been traumatised by his experience. They didn't pass judgment. They tried to contextualise what was going on. What I found very interesting about our centenary was that when we suggested that Frank Wilkinson's story should be one of the 100 stories endorsed by the government, we were told that it would embarrass the minister. And we would much rather have a positive nation-building story. Can't you give us one of those? All I want to say is that Frank Wilkinson was one of theirs. He earned the military medal, you know, and for a group of, there were military advisors to this as well, to actually say that, I found astonishing. So I guess the 100 stories are about individuals, but they're also in a way an act of protest. They're inviting us to broaden the frame of remembrance and to have the courage that that generation had. They had enormous courage. And I think the responsibility we have now is to simply tell that truth as best we can.
Yeah, and I'm afraid from what you say and what we have been researching, that the reality, when you go to individuals, it's always worse when you think. And if you think war is terrible, you're right. But when you go into these individual stories, and you look at the wives, you look at the children, particularly during the time of occupation.
So tell us more about the sources that you've used for your work on occupation.
I've been doing a lot of work
Belgium,
on the occupation during the First World War, which has been awful in Belgium and the north of France. And it's particularly awful, and it is something we can see in Ukraine now, because at the beginning of the war, the men had to go and to be at war. So the men left, and then the enemy enters in our homes, as they would say. And it is the women and the children and the elderly who are in a new front, which is this occupation front. And how you go to them? Because after the war, what happened? The male come back and speak about their heroic war, and they don't want to hear about the craziness, what was going on during the occupation.
So don't we hear about combat, not about occupation?
Exactly. Exactly. And it takes a long time for a lot of women had taken notes, memoirs, but nobody thought it was interesting. It took around 80 years to come to the surface. And now, for a while, when I began to work on that, I would receive memoirs all the time. And the people would say, it's really strange, because in our family we were always speaking about the war, never about that. And the war is much more interesting with that, which means how you keep when the enemy is in your home. And it is something we have seen recently, but the enemy had been in the home for a very short time and very brutal, and it was all war crimes of the Russian around Kiev. But imagine the same thing for 4 years. And so it's not all the time the same brutality. There is time of huge brutality, and then time where you try to cohabit because the war is going on. But still, if you don't have the voice of the women, if you don't have the voice of the children, you don't understand a thing. And these archives exist, but they were sort of concealed in the family. And it was about time to retrieve them, because after they will be totally lost.
What about this question for both of you, what about the presence, or maybe more actually the absence of women on war memorials? Your very first book was on war memorials. What do you have to say about that, about the presence or absence of women, or female figures?
Actually, in the north of France and in Belgium, you have more, because they have put the civilian casualties, so they are women. But
so you mean that the names of the civilian casualties are listed, right?
Yeah, are listed. There's not so many, but there are some which are listed. But again, not in Belgium, because all Belgium was taken, nearly, except a very small fringe. So Belgium, it was a national experience, which was occupation. So they did speak a lot about it. But northern France was just a small piece of France. So they wanted to be the same. They wanted to be part of the nation victory in 1918. So why speak about the old times when the Germans were there? So on the war memorials, most of the time, there is only soldiers, because they defended the fatherland like everybody else, like the people from the south, which was not true. But it is on this myth that they forgot about the occupation.
And thank you, Annette. What about Australia, Bruce? And what about the representation of widows, of maybe mothers? Catherine Dice is starting a PhD on mothers and motherhood in World War I. So what do you have to say about that?
I guess our classic memorial architecture, I mean, you have here the doughboy, don't you? In a way, we have an Australian parallel to that. Usually a less aggressive figure than your doughboy, standing silently, head bowed, arms reversed, a symbol of mourning. And you'll often see this statue of a soldier. Quintessentially, we're Australian, we are told, and yet, of course, imported en masse from stonemasons in Italy, who recognised a very profitable market in war memorials in the 1920s. But you'll see these in many country towns, and so it's valorising the male. But on the other hand, let's just blur the edges a little bit. Probably the most important Australian war story, and the most, I guess, heroic Australian war story, is one that could be communicated to women and children as well. And I'm thinking here of the mythology of Simpson and the donkey. Have you heard of this? Of course, and there are statues all across Australia of Simpson and the donkey. So the point about Simpson is he's a medic. His mission is to save life rather than to take it. He tends to the wounded on the slopes of Gallipoli. He's killed after a few weeks there. And the way that the men describe Simpson, I think, is really interesting. His hands are like a woman. He comforts us. It's the language of maternal care. So you've actually got this kind of blurring on the edges here in our commemorative architecture. And the new architecture that we're creating, and I'm thinking here of during the centenary, where a great deal of money went into building a new generation of statues. One of the most powerful statues is by Peter Corlett. And what is it? It's a woman who's mourning the loss of her son from Fromelles. That woman who keeps writing to Base Records Melbourne until the week that she dies in the 1940s. Why can't you find him? Can't you tell me what happened to him? And the statues are very simple but powerful ones. She's holding that telegram from Base Records, missing. That's all it says. And this really powerful symbol of remembrance, I think it's interesting that the Australian War Memorial rejected it in the grounds of the memorial, but it's maybe where it belongs, which is as a local memorial from where that woman came, Ballarat. It's at the beginning of an avenue of honour. So yes, I think the gendered language of memorials is changing. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, in France, there was a lot of war memorials with widows. So even in the 20s, they had this idea that the mourning was done by the woman. But there were more with heroic figures of soldiers, obviously. But there was a hint to the widows, and a lot was done for the widows, I mean, economically, and for the orphans also. So it is not that it was totally forgotten, but the work of the historian had not been done recently, but it's done now, and luckily.
What is very striking, I think, from the outside is to see people living, two scholars living on two different parts of the world and speaking the same language, right? So a friend, Jay Winter, says that writing history is always a dialogue. I just want briefly to clarify how can you explain that a scholar from Australia, a scholar from France, work together in the same way? Was there some kind of mutual influence? Was the Historial de la Grande Guerre part of the influence of on the Australian historiography? What did you learn from Ken Inglis? How in 5 minutes, how can you describe again this dialogue between France and Australia, or between Europe and Australia?
I think I am the oldest, so I was the first probably by accident in a way, and I think hazard in history is very important. The museum, the Historial de la Grande Guerre in Péronne, was looking for an historian to go to Australia.
And always ready to travel.
I happened to be the nomad of the group. So I said, why not? I had no idea. I was totally unaware of the importance of Australia. And then I arrived in Australia and I had the incredible luck. It's not a luck, I don't know what it is, a grace to meet Ken Inglis, this great historian we were speaking about before. And through Ken, I met Bruce, and our ways of working were very similar, that's true. But then by doing projects together, and the one in Fromelles, which is a very important place in the north of France where a number of Australians died, and which has been the place of incredible archaeological work. This is something new also. They found bodies, and they did work like you do on a very ancient site, and find incredible little objects. And then there was a ceremony of reanimation. Mm-hmm. And because Australia is a small country in numbers, not in size, they could find, and a rich country, because it's very expensive to do. In Rwanda, they cannot do it. They did DNA on some bodies, and they found the families. And I think it is the most important time in my historical life. It was with you and Ray, your wife. We were on the site the day where the families came to bury theirs 80 years later. And they were crying, and they were crying for people they had never met. Yeah. Obviously, they were born a long time after. This great uncle were dead. But they were living through the grief of the time, which has been coming through them. And I think it is my most important experience, really. And we had it together, and this, you know, this will be in us forever.
Thank you, Annette. Yes. Bruce?
Oh, the beauty of your local knowledge, Annette. There is a field, the field where these men were originally buried. They were buried en masse by the Germans, and their bodies were not recovered until 2008. But on that field, a blue flower grows, and as Annette says, that the legend is it only grows in that place. And this is something I think that spoke to those grieving families, and they were grieving. And if I could just say something here about what we found on the bodies of those men. One of the things we found was a railway ticket. A man had locked this railway ticket away in the casing of his gas mask because he knew that it would be most likely to survive there. And indeed, you know, 100 years later, we take this out of the mud and we still have it. Return ticket Perth to Fremantle. And what's that telling you? It's telling you that he thought he was coming home. Yeah. It's telling you that he invested. It's that power of luck and rumour and the mythology of war. It's actually giving that man a face. We can't give him a name because we couldn't identify him, but it's telling us so much. It's a very powerful story that speaks to us across the ages. So it was a controversial decision. I mean, should we have dug up these bodies? They were buried. They weren't buried disrespectfully by the Germans, not at all. Should we have dug them up 100 years later? I don't know. The expense, was it justified? I don't know. The creation of a new ceremony, new cemetery, that's an extraordinary expense. Can that be justified? I don't know. But on the other hand, I do know the promise that was made that generation, again, we would do everything we could to identify the men we recover, and Australia's taken that quite literally. We now have a special branch of the Australian Army that goes about looking for the war dead from World War I, World War II, and identifying through DNA testing. So it's the logical extreme. It's the obligation.
What's about the difference in the cultures of commemoration in both countries? You go, not every year, because of course, you know, COVID has changed a little bit the tradition, but with students to Gallipoli, right? And it's part, of course, many Australians go to Gallipoli as a kind of almost pilgrimage, right? And I was wondering about the pilgrimage that the French did also to the battlefields. What is specific about the memory of World War I in Australia today?
I think the memory is immediate and it's real because of the digitisation of records that I've been talking about. So we've all been riding the memory boom, and we've been able to ride the memory boom because these records are now at a touch of your fingers on a keyboard. So you can summon up the story of a great uncle that you never knew. You can have that sense of connection. In many cases, interviewing these families, there was that kind of image of a grandmother who was always grieving, this kind of story that was passed down from one family member to another. I think there are different reasons for going to Gallipoli amongst the young. I mean, let's face it, large number of Australians, expatriate community in London. What they say to me is going to Gallipoli like going home. You know, we all go together. They only spend a couple of days on the peninsula. It's the grand tour of the young. But pilgrimage and tourism have always kind of travelled together, haven't they? Absolutely. And indeed, what I find remarkable about these services is how they can lurch from one extreme to another. You know, the friendship of Australians or French reuniting again, and then the solemn remembrance around a site of mourning and mass destruction. What I think is so important about the journey to Gallipoli and the journey to France and the journey to Belgium, the journey to any war site, is that we cease to see ourselves as Australians. We realise that there are that those are marking the bodies of other families, other communities, and you cease to see war through a narrow national prism, and you actually see it as a common tragedy for humanity. So in that way, I think it sends a very important message, especially to our students.
And do you see the centennial as a kind of key moment in the relationship of that? Or?
Oh, the centennial kind of rode that tide. The centennial, it's an interesting thing, isn't it, between top-down and bottom-up remembrance? Yes. I mean, in Australia we had both. So we had massive government investment in the centenary. So you think about it. We fought for the British Empire. The British Empire spent $100 per fatality in their centenary. We spent $8,000 for every man and woman that died. We spent over $500 million marking the Great War. That's a huge investment in Australia, and we did so because the public virtually demanded it. A lot of the things that came out of that centenary are fantastic, the digitisation efforts, the forums like this one, the conversations that were fostered, but then a lot of really crazy things happened too, like every member of parliament being told, you've got $120,000 to spend in your electorate, have fun. So without any kind of consultation, in some cases with historians, people would, you know, reenact the landing on their local river at Gallipoli. You know, it didn't look much like Gallipoli. We had one crazy proposal that Floriade, which is our national flower festival, we should dig up Floriade and reenact the Battle of Lone Pine. So it went in a lot of different directions, but it did show the massive kind of popular investment in what they saw as their moment.
Thank you, Bruce. And what about France? What was the most successful in terms, and what were also maybe the limitations of Centennial in France?
Yeah, in France it was much bigger than we thought it will be. Really, we thought that after a century everybody would be tired of it, and on the contrary, And it happened something like you were saying in Australia, very local. There had been no village in France without something for the centennial. And this showed the magnitude of this war on the country till now. So there were all kind of things, some silly and some wonderful. But I think the important is that every French, in every school, in every village, in every city, in every part of the city could discover that there was something to do with this war. And when we say that this war has been the beginning of our world, and it looks like grand words, but it is a reality. It is a reality that it began somewhere between 1914 and 1918, and what began also in 1918 was the Second World War immediately, obviously. And when you see till today that Ukraine, what is the argument which is used? It is a great patriotic war. So it is the Second World War, obviously. And this is something we have to remember, that historians generally think about the past being important, but everybody thinks about it. And everybody can use it, and sometimes in a very bad way. But it is there. And so it is our work to be very aware of that and to try to put the right thing in the right direction. But we cannot do it if the individual who were in the war and who were the grandparents or the great-grandparents don't help us to do it. We cannot be cut as historians from the general public. And it is what I like about the centennial, is that it puts the general public, and they were asking for the historians, but they wanted also to do their own things. And at some point, it's important that everybody can try it.
The Grande Collecte, people bringing to the...
So the idea that go in your garage, go in your family heritage, and bring. And it was the National Archives in Paris who had this idea, and then the local archives all over the countries, and they thought they would have a few things. And it was an outpouring of things, of written material, but also images and objects. And it will take now years for people to work on these new things. And perhaps we will have another way of writing history because of this outpouring. I think this is very, very important, to give back to the people what, as historians, we can give, and they will give us a lot also. And I think it is one of the great lessons of the centennial. It was not put from the top to the people, but on the contrary, it was going back and forth. And also the transnational. I was thinking of that because I went to Gallipoli because of the Australians. But then what I found in Gallipoli, I found French cemeteries, and I found colonial cemeteries, because in Gallipoli the French were actually mostly from Black Africa or from Algeria, and you realize you are so far from France, not so far Australia, but still so far from France, and you see it was a time of a world which was colonized, and the colonies are so important in this war. And now we are in a post-colonial world with all the problems with the post-colonial. So to think about what it was 100 years ago and to put it in comparison with today, I think it's also very important in our world, which is so complicated. And when you think of the refugees from Ukraine, we were speaking about a few minutes ago, and now this idea of Boris Johnson to put refugees, not from Ukraine, from other countries, back to Rwanda, it's just amazing how this word is totally transnational, but it's also trans-craziness, how can you imagine such things? And all this is grounded in wars. Why Rwanda? It's because Rwanda has a way of getting out of genocide, which is really interesting, which is great policies of the president Kagame, but at the same time, now to get the idea that they are the most interesting country in Africa, they will sign something with Boris Johnson, which is just impossible. And so you never get out of your topics of war.
Let's maybe end the discussion with that. The question. So we are going to again have an interesting meeting in October here on the question of globalizing the history of the world wars. How do you understand this new perspective of research? I know that John Horn and Robert Gavart have coined the notion of greater war, both in terms of space and time. Do you, again, how do you see in terms of perspectives, methods, topics? What do you see as the most promising in all the paths we can follow in the future?
For me, personally, it's that you cannot study the First World War per se. It's impossible. Yeah. You have to go to the entire century. Yeah. And what happens now, it's obviously...
and start before World War I anyway, right?
And also start before. I mean, it seems just good historical work, but obviously every event has roots and has a future, obviously. But certain moments are turning points, and even if you can see in the past of the First World War a lot of things, it's definitely a turning point. But after this turning point, there are others, and if you live in a kind of bubble,
isolate,
you don't see the phenomenon, and so to put the two world wars together, I mean. Now I even don't see how you cannot do it. How can you study the Holocaust if you don't know about the genocide of the Armenians? It doesn't make any sense. And
Lemkin is a good example of that.
Lemkin is a good example of it. But this has been hard on some historians. Before the centennial, some were still saying that the Armenian genocide has nothing to do with First World War. It takes place in the same time, but it's different events. I think nobody can go on with that, but it is quite new in a way. So it is where we are going, and the program of globalization is perfect for that.
What do you see, Bruce? Thank you, Annette. What do you see, Bruce, as the main perspectives for this project on globalization? Why was it important and interesting?
I warmly endorse what Annette said. It seems to me that those men, towards the end of their lives, suffering from PTSD, they were back in the trenches, so they actually relived that moment. So you can't compartmentalise war to a single moment in time. And I would add the Armenian genocide, yes, and it's coinciding with Anzac Day. But you don't get Australian and Turkish diplomats talking about that, surprisingly, when we mark that particular day. I think we can learn so much from French scholarship. It seems to me in Australia, that grand and old kind of vision, the total vision. In Australia, we've been very slow to integrate the battlefront and the home front. In fact, Joan Beaumont's probably the first historian to do this, to have a book that moves constantly between those two different spheres. And yet we've got so much work, I think, to look at the ways that the home front and the war connected. And we can do that on Martin Lyons' study of letters, for example. So we do actually look towards French scholarship as a very successful instance of being able to offer these new perspectives. But I guess what I'm most heartened by is the things that our younger scholars are doing. And if I might just mention one of them, Emily Gallagher is a PhD candidate at the Australian National University, incredibly bright young woman. And when she set out to do her PhD on children's view of war, we all, including, I'm ashamed to confess myself, said, oh, Emily, you mightn't find the sources. You know, it'd be very difficult to actually get the source and recover the child's voice. How can you do that? She's done tremendously well. She's shown old scholars that you can discover new archives and approach them in new ways. So this willingness to actually adopt bold new perspectives, that's what I think is going to regenerate the discipline into this post-centennial phase.
So let me end with a very final question. We speak today, as you know, as one of the largest, if not the largest public universities in the country. And do you have any, and we have many young historians here, many very promising undergraduates and graduate students. Do you have any advice for the younger generation who wants to work on World War I or war in the war violence in the 20th century, connecting World War I and World War II, as you mentioned, Annette?
I think to work on these total wars, you need total knowledge. And I personally love to look at artists and writers and scientists, people who have another way to look at things, but have perhaps more imagination that we historians have. And we have to put together the imagination of artists and scientists with the rigueur. How you say rigueur? Sorry.
Strength or something.
The strength of us historians, that we know the archive, we know how to deal with that, but put the imagination of people who want to write about war, who want to paint about war. I think it's very important to crisscross the two.
Bruce, thank you, Annette. Bruce.
I think, again, we've mentioned Ken a couple of times. We haven't perhaps mentioned Jay Winter as much as we should.
We mentioned him.
We did, yes. But I guess one of the things about Jay is his emphasis on collaboration and the need to incorporate younger scholars into big projects like this one. I think that's fantastic. And I also think something that Jay says to every group of my postgraduates he's ever addressed: find your own voice, speak in your own voice. That's just such good advice. I just think that scholarship is enabling and open is what we really want for that generation.
Please join me in thanking Annette Becker and Bruce Scates for this wonderful conversation. And let's open, if you don't mind, let's open the floor to questions from the audience. Yeah, David.
Well, thank you for a very interesting conversation. I had two questions. The first was about how to define genocide and whether intentionality is an important part of that. And then you mentioned that Raphael Lemkin classified the whole of the war as a genocide. And there's certainly no denying that 5 million Ukrainians starved to death. It was caused by Soviet policies and Soviet collectivization. The reason that Soviet scholars debate whether or not that's a genocide is a question of intentionality. There's evidence that Stalin and other Politburo members actually were alarmed when they realized that there was going to be this huge change in the war. The other question is about the political utility of war memory. I wondered if you could say a little about that. Just to cite a very timely example, Annette, you mentioned that in Soviet World War II memory, there was never any mention of the Holocaust at all. Interestingly, Putin has put enormous emphasis on the Holocaust as part of World War II memory, and the reason he does it is because he can point to collaboration in Ukraine. And, you know, his entire propaganda right now is the invasion is to save Russian-speaking Ukrainians from neo-Nazis in Ukraine. So this is very useful to him.
Thank you for great question. I try to be brief because you answered also by telling the question. The thing about intention is very important. As you know, Lemkin didn't want it to so much, but it is in the 1948 convention. So it has to be an intentional plan for genocide. So this is one of the things which defines genocide. And so we have two ways of looking at it. Either we look at lawyers, people who do the law, who follow the law, and if you look at that, there has been very few genocides, which has been accepted by the United Nations Convention. actually the Jews, not the Armenian, it's still not, but I mean, everybody accepts it, but it's not. Very recently, the Cambodian one, but only part of it. Very recently, the Bosniak one, but only part of it. And obviously, the Tutsi of Rwanda. It's very little. And as historians, we have much more. We have much more. It begins with the Herero and Nama, and then the Armenians, obviously, and after the other one are the same. And I think it's very important to see the difference between the one who look at the United Nations, at the convention, and the one who look at the history. And Lemkin, who invented the word, and the word genocide he invented, he was a very good linguist. He invented it as a barbarism because it's half Greek, genos, people, half Latin, occidere, to kill. And he did it in purpose because for him it was the crime of crime, and it has to be the barbarity of barbarity. And Lemkin added at the end of his life, he thought nearly every massacre was a genocide. So if you follow Lemkin, you have genocide all over history and all over the world history. But one thing which was really important was, and I answer for Holodomor for that, was the sense that it was, for him, physical genocide, which means to kill people, biological, which means that you prevent women to have children and you prevent children to live. And it is what happened in the Holodomor. That was the case for genocide, for Holodomor, for historians still are okay, even if it was never recognized by international law. Because when Stalin discovered, and there is a very important document found by Nicolas Vert, when Stalin discovered that it was perhaps a little too much, at some point because the kids were dying, he said, oh, okay, the kids have to go with their parents. And so it's typical of the genocide idea. The kids, what Himmler was saying, the kids, if they live, they are going to revenge their parents. We don't want that. So kill the children. So that's why now, obviously, children have been dying in the aggression war of Russia. But I don't think Putin thinks that he wants to kill all the Ukrainian kids. So the case for genocide will be difficult.
Thank you very much. Keith.
Yeah, so it was mentioned that Australia has a commission to look for missing service members. I want to point out to the audience that the United States does too. It's the Defense POW-MIA Accounting Agency, and several prominent members of that agency are Ohio State PhDs from our military history program. So we have ties to that effort in the United States. To the panel, you asked why Zelensky is using the term genocide. Well, it's pretty clear. The last time the United States recognized the genocide was against the Yazidis by ISIS, and it led to a U.S.-sponsored air campaign to destroy ISIS. And this is exactly the kind of reaction that he wants in the West. So it's pretty clear why he's using the term. He wants help. But doesn't it cheapen the term when politicians just kind of throw it out in an effort to get assistance in their military efforts?
Thank you very much, Pete.
Yeah, very, very quickly, I agree. I totally agree with you. It's obviously because he wants intervention. There was little intervention for Yazidi. It was not so big, but it did. But there was no intervention in '94 for the Tutsi of Rwanda. And I remember I've seen myself in a private ceremony in the U.S., Clinton crying, saying, I did not use the term because I didn't want us involved, and I was wrong. So when your President Biden uses the term, he knows very well what he does. So Zelensky is not alone. So it's really important to see what is going on now.
No, I think the memory of the Rwandan genocide is very important.
It's absolutely important
to understand the reaction.
Yeah.
I also remember interviews of Madeleine Albright, who was the UN ambassador at the time, and was saying the same thing, that using genocide as it's a legal definition and it has legal implications, which of course is a major issue. Other questions? Or Bruce, you want to say something?
Just to respond to the opening comment there, I think there are very important differences between American and Australian commemorative culture. If you look back at the Great War, of course, families had the right to repatriate bodies, and moreover, there were pilgrimages sponsored by the state. There was certainly no question of there being state-sponsored pilgrimage in Australia. But you are right, Australia did look to the US as a model when they decided to set this up. But can I just add that whole project was again from the bottom up. It was a group of amateur historians who found the aerial photographs showing where the pits were. It was a group of amateur historians who went through the archival records saying, well, look, there's that Red Cross record. They're talking about the bodies being there. They mounted that case to government. They argued for 2 years before it was actually acted on. It was an extraordinary example of people driving history, and it was actually a humbling experience to listen to their submissions to government. So interesting the way it evolved. But now, yes, of course, it's the American model we are looking to.
You know, although most of the bodies that are recovered in a top-down, centralized manner for the United States.
Oh, yeah, of course.
There was a group of Ohio high school students who found the burial location of a World War II veteran and fed that information to DEPA, the Defense POW, and they actually got to go over there and be part of the recovery. It was really exciting.
Yeah.
Yes, Steve?
I have a tough question for you.
Oh.
I'm interested in why wars begin the way they do, when they do. And I wonder if you would answer that question.
In 2
My
minutes.
work is on the First World War.
Just 1 minute.
And wait a minute, I'm making it harder. You cannot make reference to any technology, transportation, communication, or military. Take either war.
Oh.
Oh, no. Well, as I said, there's a really interesting article by Michael Neighbour where he actually teases around with these kind of scenarios. What lessons can we draw from this? It was really interesting seeing him reflect in those ways because he seems to have spent most of his life trying to demolish the classic explanations, you know, militarism, imperialism, the whole kit.
Michael Neighbour?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So
I had him in mind, but go ahead.
yeah, exactly that. So, but I think it's interesting that the argument that there is so much contingency here. I just think that's a very impossible one to answer unless it's to generalise across wars is so difficult to do because they are so particular, they are so accidental, there are so many contingencies. It's kind of like, you know, it's that great confidence we historians used to... I'm a member of the Academy of Social Sciences. Note that, sciences, like we can prove stuff. I really don't know whether historians are entirely comfortable in that guise as scientists, although the French often talk about science in this way. I don't know that it's as precise as that, Annette.
I'm going to do a side thing, like I was saying that you need imagination. So you need imagination for that too. And I would think that one historian with the greatest imagination about wars was my hero, Mark Bloch, who was not an historian of wars, he was an historian of religion in the Middle Ages and the story of power in the Middle Ages. But he fought in 2 wars. And he said a very important thing. In the Second World War, the thinking was late. And I think the people who want to wage a war have to be early. And he thought the French were late, so they lost in 1940. And I think to understand wars, you have to understand who is thinking early.
Thanks. Questions? Yes, sir.
I think there's an important distinction between genocide, which has a lot of arguments about it, and war crime. And what has occurred in Ukraine beyond any reasonable discussion is massive war crime.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Particularly since the development of the international law of war in the Geneva Protocols, as well as the Geneva.
We totally agree, and as you know, there is already a lot of people on the ground, of policemen who are able to collect the evidence for the war crimes, for the Hague Tribunal. They are already working on the ground, but which is interesting, they work with the people of Ukraine. And again, you have this bottom-up thing. They go and speak with them and show them what happened, and they are there immediately, which is something incredibly new. Generally, war crimes are studied later, and now there are still war crime every day, and the one which are already known, are already studied. The evidence are taken. There is a word base because there are people from different countries coming to do the work. It's just extraordinary. In the same time, war crimes and looking for war crimes for the Der Hague.
And even before that, that's what the lawyer Philip Sands argues about the war. It's that it's a crime of aggression. Since the very beginning, it's a crime of aggression. That's again also that's against international law. That's the first thing. And obviously after that, yes, and that's fascinating to see investigations. Right
already.
Now during the
in the middle of the battle.
War. Absolutely, that's really it. I can.
As a historian of war, do you see any change in the nature of violence in history? Does it change from World War I to World War II to today? Or do you see something continues?
You have also 1 minute.
I think the three of us will agree, and a lot of people around here, that there is a difference between the violence, which can be technological very often because of your weapons, and the cruelty, which means that you want to inflict something special to your enemy.
And you refer to Veronique Damsgraf concept of crime.
Yes, about her and others. A lot of people have been working on that. She has been working especially on the rapes, on the women. And she did speak about this cruelty about Bosnia. And when you want to inflict a special suffering to your enemy, the war violence is violence because war is violence, and you have all kind of aims, and the enemy is going to suffer, obviously. But in cruelty, you have again a way of making suffering, especially the individual which is in front of you, and it is what happened recently in Ukraine. With women, with a lot of rape that now it's discussed in the last days, and rape with spatial violence, and which happen generally in genocides, and that's why we're discussing the argument genocide or not genocide. This kind of cruelty inside the violence of war, it's typical of genocide. So it will be also an argument in favor of genocide.
And we often use also the notion of crime of desecration, which is a crime against identities, meaning not only you're totally right about mass rapes, but also destruction of buildings, national buildings, destruction of cemeteries. Everything that relates you to your family, to your group, to your past. That's clearly a crime of desecration.
And it is the third term of genocide, cultural genocide, that Lemkin was totally for and was refused in 1948 and has been refused since, which is totally crazy when you think about it. But it's not part of the convention.
Maybe one final, or you want to?
Oh, I just say cultures of violence are very specific. And looking at it through the experience of soldiers themselves, I know that a lot of men wrote about their experience on Gallipoli in a totally different way than they did the experience on the Western Front. There it was mass mechanised technological slaughter. The violence at Gallipoli was terrible, but it was on a smaller scale, it was more intimate. You actually knew, you could see the enemy sometimes. So, in fact, a kind of strange reconciliation narrative has emerged out of the Gallipoli campaign that we haven't seen so much on the Western Front. So historians have to be alert to how the participants in that tragedy actually saw it, I think.
Can you remind us of the size? It's very small, like the battlefield of Gallipoli.
Yeah, look, the peninsula is quite large, and as you say, the French and the British are down on the south, but the Anzac area is only a few square miles, so, you know, we're not talking very much bigger than your campus here. You can walk from one end of it to the other. And most of the fighting's confined to the first and second ridges. So the intimacy of Gallipoli, as opposed to the legend of Gallipoli, which looms so large in our national consciousness, there's this real disconnect. People are shocked by the scale of it, really.
Well, we have time for one final question, if you want, or Dave, yes, thank you.
Stephen has asked about the beginning of wars. Let me ask from the other direction. Do wars ever end? I don't mean, I'm not speaking about war as a part of the human condition. I'm talking about specific war.
You know, the veterans of the First World War, they fought for the war which would put an end to all wars. We know what happened.
I'm sorry to say that we relive the war every day at the Villa-Bretonneux Memorial in France. We have films that reenact the war. We invite people to sit in their seats and have gas rising up beneath their feet and hear the artillery barrage around them, reenactment on a great scale. So it's ironic, isn't it, that a site of memory and mourning, a site which should have been for quiet contemplation of the futility of that war, has actually begun a way of reliving that war time and time again. Historians feel very uncomfortable about that interpretive centre.
Thank you very much. Thank you to our two speakers today. Thank you.